Thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about Kriya Yoga and mastering the Jhanas. So what are the jhanas? The jhanas are the description of the states of absorption that is normally talked about in Buddhist practices. And so the term jhana refers to the Sanskrit word dhyana. And those are meditative states of absorption. So why would we want to know jhanas as a Kriya yogi? Well, in Kriya Yoga, there is a correspondence between the states of meditation described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the jhanas themselves. And so in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, we talk about the yama and niyama, the moral do's and don'ts, followed by asana, a stable posture for meditation, followed by pranayama. And pranayama is a form of intentional breathing that brings us into a low idle state. It brings about pratyahara, or the effect of pratyahara. And pratyahara is internalization. And from there, as one starts to go successively deeper into meditation, one goes into dharana, which is this internalized concentration. And then one goes into dhyan, which is absorption, which is similar to jhana in Pali. And from dhyana, one can go into samadhi, into superconscious awareness. So in Kriya Yoga, we usually follow these trajectories of internalization all the way into a deep absorption and moving into samadhi. But a lot of Kriya yogis can get to a state where they are internally absorbed, but they can go no further. They get stuck in a plateau. And so an understanding of the jhanas can really help Kriya yogis to navigate those inner meditative states. Now, there can be this correlation between meditative states of absorption attained in Kriya Yoga and the jhanas. But there's a crucial distinction about the jhanas that make it very applicable to any meditative experience. And so this distinction in jhana is articulated in a variety of different Pali suttas, the words of the Buddha. For example, from Majjhima Nikaya 39. On returning from his alms round, after his meal, he sits down, folding his legs crosswise, setting his body erect and establishing mindfulness before him. Abandoning covetousness for the world, he abides with a mind free from covetousness. He purifies his mind from covetousness. Abandoning ill will and hatred, he abides with a mind free from ill will. Compassionate for the welfare of all living beings, he purifies his mind from ill will and hatred. Abandoning sloth and torpor, he abides free from sloth and torpor. Percipient of light, mindful and fully aware, he purifies his mind from sloth and torpor. Abandoning restlessness and remorse, he abides unagitated with a mind inwardly peaceful. He purifies his mind from restlessness and remorse. Abandoning doubt, he abides having gone beyond doubt, unperplexed about wholesome states. He purifies his mind from doubt. Having abandoned these 5 hindrances, imperfections of the mind that weaken wisdom, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, he enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. He makes rapture and pleasure born of seclusion drench, steep, fill, and pervade his body, so that there is no part of his whole body unpervaded by rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Just as a skilled bathman or a bathman's apprentice heaps bath powder in a metal basin and, sprinkling it gradually with water, kneads it until the moisture wets his ball of bath powder, soaks it and pervades it inside and out, yet the ball itself does not ooze, so too a bhikkhu makes the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion drench, steep, fill, and pervade his body, so that there is no part of his whole body unpervaded by the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. And so right there in that passage, one of the first things that one does to be able to go into jhana is that one abandons the 5 hindrances. These are described as imperfections of the mind that weaken wisdom. So sensual craving, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and remorse, and doubt. These are a general category of attachments of the mind that impede one from going into deep meditative state. And so from my perspective, this is one of the major reasons why people will plateau in Kriya Yoga, is because they don't realize that their mind is attached to hindrances. And certainly I know this is the case because I also experienced this for a large part of my meditation journey. So despite the fact of having very potent practice of pranayama through Kriya Yoga, I'd reach a plateau where I was able to go no further in meditation. And this was the reason I didn't realize that the attachment that I had was what was preventing me. It was bringing up a hindrance, and I couldn't recognize the hindrance and abandon it. And so in the original teachings of the Buddha, one needs to abandon those hindrances, those imperfections of the mind that weaken wisdom. And when one does this, the mind starts to move into jhana, into the first jhana. So how do we do this? How do we abandon these 5 hindrances? Well, there are a couple of aspects about the hindrances that hold them in place. And the first is the stories that we tell ourselves about what is happening. These are narratives developed to help support the storyline of the self, of the separate self, of the ego self. And in Sanskrit, these are called vikalpas. And often these vikalpas, they are guesses at the best of times about what is happening in any particular situation that one is experiencing. And it's often rife with misinterpretation. So for example, you're standing in a lineup to get coffee at the local coffee bar. And it's quite busy that morning. And you give your order to the barista, and the barista doesn't even look at you or hardly even respond. And then from there, you can create a whole host of different descriptions about what you think is happening at any particular moment. This guy's really unfriendly. He's not treating me like I deserve. I'm a regular customer here. I deserve to be treated in a more friendly way. Don't you know that I spend my hard-earned money, and so on and so on and so on. So that story that one tells oneself really helps to solidify the view of this separate self. And when one is resisting reality, not accepting as it is, and creating a story, there is an impression of the experience which becomes embedded in one's consciousness. This is called samskaras, karmic seeds. Basically what this means is that one is not able to complete the experience. The experience is stored as an impression in one, and one cannot let it go. So you can see how this is like a snowball rolling down the hill, where you have the initial resistance paired with the vikalpa, which creates the false narrative of what's happening, paired with the undigested samskara, the impression or remnant of the experience, and it builds and it builds and builds. And this is the reason why people can create all sorts of distorted viewpoints about themselves based on very little information and their resistance to their experiences. And this is what we're dealing with in meditation. So regardless of the fact that one uses a meditative technique to get into an internalized state, there are still all of those samskaras and vikalpas that are floating around in the psyche. And unless one is able to recognize those and then to let them go, to abandon them, one cannot go into jhana. Now, why would you want to go into jhana? So the jhanas are best described as states of cessation of attachment and states of insight and awakening. So one is releasing attachment to the sense of separate self supported by vikalpas and undigested samskaras, and one is developing insight into how one does that process of ahamkara, of I-making, and allowing those false stories and undigested impressions to merge into the ground of being, thereby freeing one's consciousness from attachment. What happens when you're able to do this is that the mind becomes joyful. This spontaneous joy called pamoja arises in your consciousness because there's a sudden relief of letting go of something that has been holding you back. And then out of that, there's a spontaneous emergence of jhana. And what happens then is one starts to experience signs that one is going into an internalized state and the mind is free from attachment. And so one starts to experience these different signs of going into an internalized state. Rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So you can feel these feelings, piti, which is rapturous feelings in the body, and sukha, which is this feeling of contentedness or joyfulness that starts to manifest naturally. You're going in the direction of your true essence nature, which is ananda, bliss. And as the mind becomes more collected around your meditation, you enter the second jhana. Again, bhikkhus, With the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind without applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of concentration. He makes the rapture and pleasure born of concentration drench, steep, fill, and pervade this body, so that there is no part of his whole body unpervaded by the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. And as one goes even deeper, the rapturous feelings of the body too start to fade away. Again, bhikkhus, with a fading away as well of rapture, a bhikkhu abides in equanimity and mindful and fully aware. Still feeling pleasure with the body, he enters upon and abides in the third jhana, on account of which noble ones announce he has a pleasant abiding who has equanimity and is mindful. And as one starts to go even deeper, the body itself starts to disappear from one's awareness. Again, bhikkhus, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, with the previous disappearance of joy and grief, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. He sits pervading his body with a bright, pure mind, so that there is no part of his whole body unpervaded by the bright, pure mind. And so one's experience in these first through the fourth jhanas is not possible unless one has abandoned the hindrances, unless one has discarded one's stories about oneself, unless one has recognized the latent impressions of undigested experience, the samskaras that start to manifest even in meditation. If one is able to allow those to dissolve and one continues to progress through deepening meditative states and recognition of one's true essence nature towards one's awakening. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to send me an email at info@modernkriya.com. Also check our website at modernkriya.com and our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.